I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned after having taken hundreds of thousands of street photography images over the many years of being a photographer. Now, some of these learnings I'm going to share with you may or may not be controversial, so buckle up. And I've got 7 points for you, so let's just jump into the very first one. Number 1, history isn't always the best place to look for inspiration. All right, let's start with a very controversial one right off the bat. See, street photographers love to look at history for an example of what they think good photography might be. Henri Cartier-Bresson, Saul Leiter, Van Ho. In the street photography industry, people are obsessed with holding these people to the highest prestige. And personally, I don't think that's such a good idea. What I see all the time is that new photographers, and even old ones, hold on to the works of these generational giants as the shining beacon of what good street photography looks like, and they never let them go. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these historical street photographers are bad by today's standards. You know, street photography is extremely personal, and what is good for me may not be good for you. Plus, you know, everyone takes good and bad shots on any given day, and not every single shot is a banger anyway. But what I am saying is that it feels like there's a particular style, a particular way of shooting that is very reminiscent of the look of the past. There's a look that these photographers had. And if everyone is constantly looking towards these generational giants for inspiration, then everyone's work is just going to end up looking the same. I see street photography as such a ever-evolving, dynamic thing. And the idea of everyone looking to the same subsection of photography history really rubs me the wrong way. You know, much like how sport progresses over time, you know, like people get faster, they get better, they become more skilled. The technology they use enables them to improve and allows them to do things that were previously unachievable. Street photography, and all forms of photography for that matter, should be like that, in my opinion. You know, what counts as good now in today's age with modern cameras and sharp lenses and great autofocus should look quite different to what good used to look like when cameras were first taken onto the street. Not only that, with the progression of the industry itself, street photography and the themes of street photography just in general have progressed so much over the years that it should look radically different to how it used to look. You know, rather than look only to the past, immerse yourself with the inspiration from all eras of street photography, including the present, and don't hold yourself to just one specific era of street. Number 2, street photography is personal. Street photography has the most amount of elitists in any genre of photography, period. There are just so many people who think that a particular style or a particular method of doing something is the superior way of doing it. Right? You have the magnum elitists, you have the zone focusing elitists, you have the up close and personal elitists, and like every subculture in between, you know, every group kicking and screaming louder than the last, proclaiming that their way is the best way and every other way sucks. And at the start of my photography journey, I never really understood why this was the case. You know, why so much evangelism for a particular method? Why so much anger? Why so much loyalty? And over the years, I've finally developed the empathy to understand why. It's because street photography is so personal. Personal in the capture, in who you decide to photograph. Personal in the subject and how their emotions are displayed. Personal in the method and what lens you use, or what focus technique suits you best. Personal in the edit and the aesthetic of what you're trying to pull off. The street images that you take represent you as a photographer in so many dimensions, and people feel a very deep sense of ownership towards that, and therefore become very defensive or preachy about it because that ownership is tied to their identity. The photos represent who they are. And in street, if you shoot up close and personal, you're basically telling the world, you know, hey, I've got the balls to do this properly. And of course, whether or not that's actually true is beside the point. And if you shoot in, let's say, film, that might be a statement about your love for slowing things down and enjoying the process. Or if you're using zone focusing exclusively, well, maybe you're doing things on hard mode, and that might say more about you than you think. Or maybe because of that, you relish the difficulty and the challenge and you like that approach. Regardless, what you take a photo of, how you take that photo, and how you present that photo to the world says a lot about you when it comes to street photography. And I've learned that over time that people become very, very attached to their street images. And for better or for worse, that to me explains the behavior. And that gives me a lot of empathy to step back and see that in street photography, there is no good or bad. There is just preference. And you might have a style that is a little bit more universally digestible and approachable, or you might have a style that's deep and brooding and full of rumination, or you might have a style that's wild and zany and just a little bit out there. All of it is good to someone and all of it is bad to someone else. It's just preference. And understanding that allows you to have a greater empathy towards the people who end up viewing your work. Number 3, street photography has the most amount of domain knowledge. That all being said, because there's just so many ways to express yourself in street photography, I would argue that street photography contains the most amount of domain knowledge to start to do well at a more holistic level. And what I mean by that is that there are so many patterns to learn within so many different terrain types and settings, but that is also the opportunity in street to make a unique photo as well. Things like hard light, soft light, silhouette, shadow, metaphorical contrast and juxtaposition, physical contrast. And there are so many different styles you can use in street and categories of photography you can use in street as well. Landscape style shots, detail style shots. You can take street portraits, you can take architecture images. Hell, you could even get lucky and find yourself in a fashion shoot on the street as well. There are just so many different terrains to learn as well. Big skyscrapers, tunnels, train stations. When you get out on the street for many years, you begin to look at every doorway, every street crossing or bridge in just a different way. Even without a camera, you might start to look for leading lines in a market, or become more cognizant of how people look like when they're commuting, or get lost in seeing the entire world in figures and frames. There's just so much to learn in street photography, and it takes years and years and hundreds of thousands of steps to start to learn all of this stuff. And honestly, it never ends. Number 4, practicing with a theme is the fastest way to grow. Now, for a more practical, tactical point, going out there to practice a particular theme or pattern is, in my opinion, the fastest way to grow your skills and to begin to improve your vision as a photographer. Now, I've already made an entire video series on visual patterns, which I will leave a link to in the description box below. But going out every single time with a particular objective and practicing that objective for the entire street shoot allows you to improve your vision for that particular pattern immensely. Now, for example, one of my favorite patterns is hard light. So I will spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours on the street only shooting hard light. And then next week, I might choose something else like scale. And then I'll spend an afternoon shooting that, and then on and on and on every single week. And when you repeat this for years and years, your skill set becomes so large that you're able to see all of these different compositions wherever you are. And over time, once you've built those skills and become really well practiced at that, plus your domain knowledge as well, you'll find that you gravitate towards some patterns over others. And of course, if you've watched the channel before, you'll have heard me say, this is the genesis of your style, your actual style, your true style, not just your visual aesthetic of, your edits and that kind of stuff. I find that practicing with a theme or objective in mind every single time is just a very easy and natural way of engaging in the practice of photography. And even though I myself am well versed in many different patterns, I still find myself returning to the practice of shooting just one thing time and time again. It never ends, and I highly recommend it. Number 5, mastering prediction. Continuing with the practical advice, one of the big problems in street photography is missing the shot. And oh man, I used to suffer so much from this so badly in the first few years. When I first started street photography, I had a good eye from a decade of product design, but I used to be so slow on my camera. And because of that, I just kept messing up the settings and missing shots. And it was such a frustrating experience. Of course, over the years, my technical control got better and better to the point where now I can change the optimal settings for any scene within a second and even without looking. But one thing that really raised my strike rate when it comes to photography is mastering prediction. Now, prediction in street photography requires you to have seen a pattern before, and then in a new scenario, guess where the next point of that pattern is going to occur, and then take a picture of that. Now, this completely removes the need for you to be fast on the settings, increasing your strike rate every single time. And as a basic example, if you want to frame someone dead center on the street, then you know as a pattern that people will be walking from left to right across the street. And because you've seen this before, you've seen this pattern of behavior before, you can anticipate what's going to happen so that you can prepare your settings beforehand and wait for the perfect moment to then click that shutter button. Now, of course, this is a super simple example, but especially when you are dealing with capturing people's behavior, people's behavior in most situations are going to be somewhat predictable and probably follow some kind of pattern, and therefore they can be predicted and anticipated with you ready at the other end to snap your shutter button. Now, I love this technique specifically for framing subjects or placing subjects in exactly the right location that I want them to be in the composition. However, there are many other uses for prediction as well. Another one is distance. If you are shooting close up, or you want to shoot close up, for example, the closer you get to the potential range of your subject, the faster the shutter speed you're going to need to shoot with to freeze the frame, right? So if you're in proximity and preparing to shoot someone close to you and you know it, then knowing to rack the shutter speed 1 or 2 clicks is going to help ensure those sharp shots and increase your strike rate. So predicting how close your actual subject will be. Now, prediction really only works if you've seen the patterns before. This requires you to put a tremendous amount of time into being on the street, observing how people behave, noticing just how similar humans are and how much we actually end up repeating ourselves. This is the original form of training an AI with a large enough data set, right? With humans, it's the same thing. We need to see the steps to make the associations, to make the pattern. And once we have that pattern, when we see it over and over and over again, we can recall and predict new circumstances with a certain level of certainty. So get out there and start walking. Number 6, when the gear matters. When it comes to gear in street, things are just a little bit different to how other categories of photography might work. In street, I found that the most important thing most people are concerned about isn't the sensor size that you have, or the lenses that you use, or even the performance of your camera. I find that the most important thing that determines the success of your street images is actually the usability of your gear. And by usability, I mean size and weight and function. Most photographers don't want big cameras when it comes to street photography, and rightfully so. In street, we are just moving around so much all the time for like hours and hours on end, and we don't use tripods, and we rarely take breaks, and we always have to be alert and on point. And the last thing that you want when you're out and about on the street is a gigantic, 7200 and a heavy full frame body dangling from your neck. Now, of course, that's a look. And if you want to do that with your work, then by all means, go ahead and do so. But I found that most street photographers are looking to reduce the size of the footprint of their cameras, making sure that they are light and easy to use. Smaller and lighter cameras allow you to go for longer, and I've found this to be true for myself as well on the street. While I absolutely adore my Sony A1 and I usually pair it with a 35mm or an 85mm prime, When I'm out there using my RX100 pocket camera, I'm just so much more nimble, and I feel not only physically lighter, but also mentally lighter when I'm using that versus my bigger full frame setup. And smaller cameras tend to scare people away less as well. You know, the people that you photograph tend to be less put off by the guy who has a tiny small pocket camera versus the guy with a setup the size of a newborn baby. You know, from there, other things like fast autofocus and fast apertures and other nice to have things are great. But the interesting thing about street photography is that most of the time, it's more about the story or the beauty that you're presenting. And the technical quality and the technical accurateness is actually the most lenient out of all categories of photography, in my opinion. So gear in this respect is certainly less important. Number 7, it ain't that deep, bro. Now, this all leads nicely to the very last point of the video, which is that street photography isn't all that deep, or at least it doesn't need to be all of the time. You know, sure, an image can really have a lot of layers to it, right? It can tell a strong story and it can evoke an emotion and it can move you. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. If it's just something that looks pretty or it's aesthetic, then that's totally fine as an image as well. You know, for me, I'm the kind of person who will take an image and analyze the crap out of it. The technical detail, the metaphorical message, the abstract concept, and what the photographer was trying to get at, all of it. But over the years, I've learned that sometimes, most of the time, it just ain't that deep. You know, a photo made for the sake of capturing beauty is just as valid as a photo capturing a moment full of emotion and meaningful depth. And honestly, I kind of laugh at the idea that there are some people who think that the best street photographers out there fart out excellence with every single press of the shutter button. You know, that every single image that they make came with the wisdom of 6 tomes of knowledge and a lifetime's worth of inspirational quotes. It just ain't that deep. You know, so often we overstate the meaning of images and give them way more meaning than what was originally intended. But a pretty composition captured because it's a pretty composition is just a pretty composition, and that's all it really needs to be, and that's all it really needs to be celebrated for. You know, photography is a visual art after all. Aesthetics do matter. So next time you're out and about and you want to go and take a photo of something because it catches your eye, or you think there's just something interesting about it, go and take that photo. Don't feel ashamed because it doesn't have as much emotional depth as what you think your hero photographers have, because you'd be surprised to learn that your heroes are just like you. They thought it was pretty too. All right, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed some of the lessons that I've learned about street photography over the many years. And if you want to learn 5 more tips and techniques that all street photography pros use, make sure to check out this video right here. Alrighty, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video, but until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.